University. She holds a PhD in philosophy from the CUNY Graduate Center and an MA in philosophy from Western University. From 2018-2019, she worked as a postdoctoral fellow at the Ethics Center at the University of Oxford. Her interest spans several questions that arise at the intersections of medical ethics, psychiatry, philosophy of science, and research ethics. Among other topics, she has written about the harms of failing to acknowledge the impact of the placebo effect in both research and clinical contexts, the issue of inconsistency within and across research ethics boards, the role of responsibility in the allocation of healthcare resources, the promises and challenges related to participatory research, and the importance of requiring consent for educational pelvic examinations on women under anesthetic. Among numerous papers published, she's the author with Shevlin of Pain, Placebo and Cognitive Penetration, forthcoming in Mind and Language, and Distancing Medically Assisted Dying from Suicide, Is It Justified? Forthcoming as well in the Hastings Center report. And today she's going to talk about standpoint theory and the psi-sciences. Can marginalization and critical engagement lead to an epistemic advantage? Phoebe Friesen, thank you very much for being here today. And it's your talk now.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah and Anne-Marie. And just a huge thank you for organizing this series. There's obviously a big demand for, philosophy of psychiatry content, given the audience last week and this week, and, how much enthusiasm you've had. So I'll just say I'm really happy to be here. And, when I saw the list of speakers, I was, really excited. There's so many of my favorite people speaking, and it's a real honor to be on that list with them. So I'll just share my screen to start my slides. Okay, can you all see that?
Yes, I think it's working well.
Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to talk about standpoint theory and the psi-sciences today. So the question driving this talk is, can marginalization and critical engagement lead to an epistemic advantage? So I'm taking, standpoint theory in its sort of classical sense and applying it to the psi-sciences. And I want to acknowledge that the paper that is the product of this project was co-written with my friend and collaborator, Jordan Goldstein. So this project actually started years ago. I actually, just looked it up and I presented a version of this, a very early tiny version at an AAPP conference in 2017, which feels like eternity ago. And the project has changed shape a lot. It's grown quite a bit. It's much better informed today, I think. And a huge part of that is that my friend Jordan came in to work on it with me. So at the time he was doing a PhD in medical anthropology, but also had his own lived experience and had worked as a peer specialist for years. So we spent a lot of time thinking about how we can apply this theory, what makes sense in terms of corroborating evidence for a theory like this in the psi-sciences. And the paper's grown into what it is today. So there is a manuscript that's been under review for more than a year, as is not unusual in philosophy, but I'd be happy to share it with anyone who's interested. You can just send me an email and hopefully it'll see the light of day eventually. So just a couple sort of, one point I wanted to acknowledge, we were using the term psi-sciences, which may or may not be familiar. So this is just a way of broadening out from psychiatry, as is often used, to also include psychology, psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, all the other sort of psis that are at play, to expand our breadth of what we're thinking about in terms of the knowledge projects we have in mind within this particular project. But our sort of main target is psychiatry proper, and most of the time we're thinking about academic, scientific work, not other knowledge projects. So I'm going to give a brief intro or outline to start, just of what's coming in the next 40-45 minutes. So first I want to talk a little bit about the participatory shift that we're a part of today. Then I'll talk a little bit about what standpoint theory is for those of you who are unfamiliar. Talk about the forms of evidence that are typically offered for standpoint theory, and then take that theory and apply it to the sciences more specifically. So we asked the question, what would it look like for standpoint theory to exist in relation to the sciences? What would evidence for a standpoint theory in the sciences look like? And then finally consider some of the implications and some of the objections one might raise. So first, just a bit of framing this participatory shift. I'm sure this is not unfamiliar to many of you, but we're in this kind of incredible moment, incredible conversation, where there's a lot of discussion and movement and action around democratizing health research and research more generally, but particularly health research. So this refrain of nothing about us without us, which we've heard for a very long time, is starting to be heard, particularly within the academy, within scientific projects. And we're seeing uptake. So we're seeing a lot of funding streams that are attached to requirements that there be some sort of participatory engagement. So you ought to involve those who are impacted by your research in the research process itself. We're seeing that kind of shift taking place more and more in different places. So we have things like PCORI in the United States, we have the SPORE funding in Canada, we have Involve in the UK, and I think these really symbolize a lot of uptake around this participatory shift across the world. And with that, we also see more and more recognition of the potential contributions that those who are impacted by research can make to research itself. So I think especially we can see this in the UK, where following on this sort of involvement shift, we see a huge body of research attempting to document the impact of involving patients or the public or others, stakeholders in research processes. There's a lot of questions around that impact agenda and that kind of research, but it symbolizes, I think, a really important shift we're seeing around, who ought to contribute to research and shape research questions. But I think there are a lot of questions of expertise still at play within this sphere. So we see a lot of sort of quick assertions around expertise or assumptions around expertise. And then we also see a lot of disputes around expertise. So that could be about a particular patient group or, involving the public. And so I think it's worth spending a bit of time digging through some of the arguments for an epistemic advantage or expertise that patient groups might have. And that's what we're doing in this paper. And I also just want to acknowledge, the manuscript is building on a lot of existing scholarship. So philosophers have written about the importance of service user involvement in the sciences. Before this, there's a lot of really interesting work in this space. And there's also a lot of really interesting work by service user researchers themselves, some of which explicitly draws on feminist standpoint theory. So particularly by Diana Rose and Alison Faulkner. There's already sort of a beginning to this conversation. I hope this will complement and extend that. Okay, so what is standpoint theory? So basically, I'm following Alison Wiley here in identifying sort of two necessary components that are required in order for someone to achieve a standpoint. So the two components are a marginalized social location and a period of critical reflection. So I'll describe each of these in more detail in a second. And so those two components make up the descriptive claim of standpoint theory, which is just if you have these two components and these two components are necessary, that's how you achieve a standpoint. And that standpoint is in relation to a particular kind of knowledge project or domain. It's not a standpoint with regards to anything. And then the second claim of standpoint theory is a normative one. So this is the one that suggests that if an individual has a standpoint, so, has a marginalized social location, has engaged in this period of critical reflection, then that individual has an epistemic advantage within a particular knowledge project. So this is the normative claim. So I'll expand on each of those. So when we think about the marginalized social location, that is the first component of having a standpoint, it's worth going back to Marx, where standpoint theory's roots are. So Marx and Engels observed that the class which has the means of material production at its disposal has control at the same time over the means of mental production. So here they're just linking knowledge and power in a way that's probably not surprising or unfamiliar to many of you. And the idea is just that those who are in control, who control the means of production, also control the kinds of ideas that are common in society, and often do so in a way that the control is invisible. So the ideas feel like they are objective, that they're just existing, but they're not produced by a particular view or standpoint. Probably shouldn't use the word standpoint there, it'll be confusing, but they're not coming from a particular location. And Marx also argued as a result of this that the proletariat, the working class, have a particular advantage with regards to identifying what's going on with regards to how knowledge is produced. That being outside of that ruling class that controls the means of production means that you have this particular kind of epistemic advantage with regards to figuring out what's going on and producing knowledge. So years later, Nancy Hartzog took this and applied it to women's unique standpoints. So for her, the ruling class was men who were primarily controlling how knowledge was created in all sorts of areas of life. And she suggested that as a result of women's oppression and social location, they had this unique ability to locate the ways in which knowledge was produced in this partial perspective. And so Hartzog was criticized by some for being sort of essentialist with regards to women's knowledge, but standpoint theory very much has its roots in her work and now has developed to mostly assert this claim about marginalized social location in what's called the thesis of socially situated knowledge. So this is a really simple, intuitive claim that I think most of you would accept. It really just suggests that what we know is structurally shaped and shaped by our social location. So as Alison Wiley puts it, social location systematically shapes and limits what we know, including tacit experiential knowledge, as well as explicit understanding, what we take knowledge to be, as well as specific epistemic content. So this can mean something as simple as, you grow up in a home of doctors or a home of politicians, you're just likely to know more about medicine or about politics as a result of that exposure. But it can also be about the kinds of knowledge you value, what you take knowledge to be in a sort of broader sense. And I think we would all, accept a thesis like that. And so standpoint theory focuses particularly on those who have a social location that is marginalized. And as a result of that, they're less likely to be a part of the groups who are producing sort of dominant knowledge within society that gets taken up. And so as a result, there's sort of this unique potential for an epistemic advantage. But essentially, there's nothing that comes with just having that social location. You don't yet have the advantage. You need to combine it with this period of critical reflection. And also importantly, there's no essentialism or relativism implied by this thesis. So it isn't the case that if you embody a particular social location, say you have a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, or you're Indigenous, or you're a woman, or you're a person of color, there's no essential body of knowledge that comes with any of those qualities. It's just a particular likelihood of being exposed to other kinds of ways of thinking, ways of knowing that leads to this potential. So the second component of standpoint theory is critical reflection. So essentially, this is something all standpoint theorists agree on, even if this isn't entirely unpacked in the literature, is that a standpoint isn't something that falls naturally out of a social location. It's something that is struggled for and achieved. So Wiley says standpoints are struggled for, achieved by epistemic agents who are critically aware of the conditions under which knowledge is produced and authorized. So again, we see this link between knowledge and power. And this is sort of the heart of this second component of critical reflection, is that there's a period of engaging in thinking critically about the way knowledge is produced in a particular domain and how power impacts that production of knowledge. So Sandra Harding says, each oppressed group can learn to identify distinctive opportunities to turn, oops, sorry, I can't see my slides here, an oppressive feature of the group's conditions into a source of critical insight about how the dominant society thinks and is structured. So you can see that the social location is particular, relevant to a particular domain, and that marginalization and that social location gives one this sort of potential, this opportunity, as Harding calls it, that by way of critical reflection after that period can lead to this critical insight or this epistemic advantage. So what is the epistemic advantage? So this is something that looks different in different standpoint theorists' work as well, but broadly, 3 different kinds of epistemic tasks or advantages arise in this literature. So the first one that comes up very regularly is the ability to identify problematic background assumptions. So those that have a standpoint by virtue of being outside of sort of the dominant class who produces knowledge just are able to see more clearly, more quickly, are more likely to identify problematic assumptions that might be guiding research programs or playing a role in theories or hypotheses. And related to that, the second epistemic task is one of developing new tools and theories. So filling in those gaps that are left by the identification of these assumptions, or just being able to identify new explanatory resources or think about new hypotheses that aren't visible from those in the inside. This is the second epistemic task. And the third is a little bit less clear. People talk about it in a lot of different ways, but objectivity is a term that comes up a lot in the literature. So probably some of you are familiar with strong objectivity, Sandra Harding's term, which seeks to replace this sort of traditional notion of objectivity as a view from nowhere, and instead locates the values that are always at play in scientific projects and seeks to identify them and reflect on them. So sometimes they might be appropriate, other times they might be inappropriate. But she argues this makes for a stronger kind of objectivity than one which denies there's any sort of agency or decision-making within scientific practices. Objectivity also comes up in other ways. So Alison Wiley talks about objectivity as when we have particular kinds of epistemic qualities that we care about, things like empirical adequacy. Kristen Intiman talks about objectivity as a characteristic of scientific communities. So as a result of diversity, if we include people with standpoints, they'll be less likely to have things like individual biases at play. So that's sort of a mess of different ways of thinking about objectivity, which, is characteristic of, conversations about objectivity, but it's definitely clear that standpoint theorists emphasize how, including those with standpoints in knowledge projects will contribute to objectivity of one sort or another. Okay. So what does evidence for standpoint theory look like? So typically, if we think of sort of the classic works related to standpoint theory, we see evidence for standpoint theory in descriptions of shifts that have taken place in epistemic landscapes after individuals who have experienced some sort of oppression or marginalization, usually women, join the ranks of the discipline. So they're usually stories about an academic discipline, bumbling along with several assumptions at play, and then have women enter or women of color enter or whoever enter, and the scene sort of shifts and assumptions become revealed, new theories are developed, and things progress. So some of the famous examples you might be familiar with, Patricia Hill Collins on the unique contributions of Black feminist scholars to sociology. She wrote about the way in which white feminist scholars were assuming a lot of things about how their lives looked and how that could extend to all other women. But when Black feminist scholars entered the scene, they illuminated a lot of other ways in which their lives looked that weren't captured by these white feminists writing. So this is an important early work around intersectionality, intersectionist feminism. So Donna Haraway, this is also a really famous example or paradigmatic example of standpoint theory. She wrote about the ways in which female primatologists entered the field and corrected for all sorts of biases that were at play in theories and methods, and then developed better theories to replace those. Alison Wiley has written about how there was a unrepresentation of women in the past in the academy, and there was a lot of sort of theories and work being done to explore how they were just less naturally capable of producing work. You know, they're women. But then when women entered the field, they revealed that an alternative explanation for the difficulties they faced had something to do with the climates and their underrepresentation and how that contributed to their struggles. Carol Gilligan, I think, is actually a really good example of standpoint theory, although she isn't often taken up as an example of standpoint theory. But this is probably an example familiar to a lot of you. Carol Gilligan was a moral psychology or a graduate student working with Lawrence Kohlberg, who developed a theory of moral development. And she was a graduate student working in the field, basically applying this moral test to a lot of children. So she went out interviewing a lot of kids and asking them about this particular moral dilemma. And the results showed that all these little boys were much more morally developed than all these little girls. And as a result, she came to question this theory of moral development, this particular scale that Kohlberg had developed, and ended up writing a book in a different voice, advocating for another kind of ethical thinking that women were more inclined to. So again, we see lots of worries about essentialism in response to this. But basically the idea, the sort of standpoint insight here is that there was assumptions going on in Kohlberg's theory of moral development that weren't visible to him and perhaps weren't visible to other men who would be more inclined to sort of take them up or think in this particular kind of way, and they were visible to Gilligan. Okay, so now a shift from thinking about standpoint theory in general to thinking about standpoint theory in the sciences in particular. So again, what we do in the manuscript is think about these two sort of essential components that make up a standpoint, marginalized social location and a period of critical reflection, and think about, what does that look like in the sciences, or how has that looked? So thinking about marginalization in the sciences and psychiatry is, immediately a lot comes to mind, I'm sure, for all of us. So how we define it is having a lived experience of being diagnosed with a mental illness or experiencing the mental health system as a service user. Sorry, that last word is missing. We also talked about how, those who are involved in other kinds of ways as caregivers, as friends, as partners of people who are having these experiences may also experience a kind of marginalization of their own, but we focus on those who are service users themselves in the manuscript. But, I'd be happy to talk about questions around that in the Q&A. So what are the kinds of experiences that are common but not necessary to those who are service users or have experienced being diagnosed with a mental disorder? Things like stigma, paternalism, so forced treatment is common, denials of autonomy or one's capacity, coercion, loss of hope. I think it's important to recognize that different forms of marginalization, different identity characteristics will intersect and impact one's particular experiences of marginalization in this space. So it will look different for people who are both experiencing a diagnosis for the first time and are people of color entering a system, different sexualities, all sorts of other qualities will interplay with the kind of marginalization one might experience. I think another thing that's essential to think about here is the way in which one's receiving a diagnosis is often, inherently a denial of one's rationality. So one's epistemic agency is often denied within that experience. So there's this real kind of epistemic violence, it's been called, or epistemic injustice, to use Fricker's term, that is at play here. So on the one hand, it makes a project like this, which interrogates whether there might be an epistemic advantage in this group, all the more important given what it's responding to, but it also makes it all the more difficult. And I've, had even just the reviewer comments, which I'll talk a little bit about later, very much played into this essential link between madness and unreason and sort of looping those together. And so there's a lot at play here in terms of epistemic injustice or denials of one's epistemic authority or agency. So LeBlanc and Kinsella have defined saneism as the systematic discrimination and oppression of those who have or are perceived as having a psychiatric diagnosis. So you can unpack this in a lot of different ways, but this is sort of a general sense. And then this second component, so critical reflection. What does it look like in the sciences? So essentially, as with other standpoint theories, it involves reflecting on the distribution of power within the sciences and how knowledge is produced in relation to power. So this kind of period of critical reflection or engagement can look really different for different people. So it could involve reading, writing, consciousness raising, involvement with consumer-run support groups, peer-run centers, engaging in research, working, volunteering in a capacity related to mental health care. So we hear stories of a lot of people who've engaged in a huge variety of ways and sort of come to recognizing that their experience may not be captured by, dominant models or explanations that have been offered to them. And I think it's important to make space for that variety in this process of critical reflection. And so Alison Faulkner, a service user researcher, also acknowledges sort of this second component of what it is to become someone with a standpoint or someone with this epistemic advantage. She says, for survivor research to transform knowledge, those involved need more than the experience of being mad or using services. So there's something additional that needs to take place to attain this position of having a standpoint. Tassin Noorani has also talked about these processes of being involved in collectives or self-help groups with communities of other people deemed mad. Talks about the way in which the processes of sharing one's experiences, hearing about the experiences of many others, and discussing the ways in which knowledge is shaped. In this way, experiences become more weighty, they collectivize over time. So there's a sense in which I think in all of these cases, whether it's an individual who's on their own reading a lot of books or somebody who's involved in, a service user or survivor research program or somebody who's involved in a consciousness raising group, there's a sense of recreating new ways of knowing, new kinds of knowledge, whether that's about one's own individual experience and understanding what happened, or about what others have experienced within mental health services. There's this kind of new knowledge creation happening across these cases. So then we ask the question, well, what would evidence for standpoint theory in the sciences look like? And so again, we follow standpoint theorists before us, suggesting that it's likely found in evidence for shifts in the sciences that have occurred as a result of those who have attained a standpoint. So we particularly look at evidence for two of the epistemic tasks that I identified. So one, the practice of identifying problematic background assumptions, and two, that of developing novel tools and theories. So the third, of course, is objectivity, which is a lot harder to sort of pinpoint, but I think you'll see examples of increased objectivity in the other examples that we offer. And just two caveats, so within these examples, we're very much focused on knowledge produced within the sciences, but this isn't to deny that there is knowledge being produced in other MAD communities all the time that isn't taken up in the sciences. So this is very much focused on where the power is consolidated, where the decisions are being made, but not necessarily saying there isn't other knowledge out there. And as a result of that, related to that, a lot of the examples are taken from the global north. And again, this isn't to say there isn't a ton of really important work and knowledge being produced in the global south, but there's a different kind of conversation going on Partially, this is about funding. We see a lot less psychiatrists, a lot less work being done in the sciences in the Global South. A lot of caretaking or support systems occur not in institutions or medical structures, but in the community. Religious leaders play a role. It's a really different kind of setup. And so when you talk about something like the sciences, the examples just tend to pop up. There's also just Jordan and I's language limitations of only speaking English, and that's sort of what we found or are more familiar with given where we're based in the world, which is in Canada and the States. So those two caveats. Okay, so the first kind of evidence, so the identification of background assumptions. So we offer 4, but there's, I think, a ton more that could be identified. I'd love to hear people's sort of thoughts and ideas on this in the Q&A. So the first is this assumption that well-being is equivalent to symptom reduction. So this is something I've written about elsewhere, particularly around research around schizophrenia, but the idea that for a long time in the psychiatric research, the endpoints that are the most meaningful or determinations of efficacy have been symptom scales. So the idea here is there's an assumption built into these research programs that if one has a reduction on a symptom scale, their quality of life is better, they're doing better, this drug or this intervention or whatever it is a success. But of course, service users have pointed out for a really long time, a reduction in symptoms doesn't always mean greater well-being. So it's certainly possible that one could have a reduction in symptoms as a result of a medication that actually makes them feel worse on a day-to-day basis. So they might have a worse quality of life while also being considered a success as a result of a measure on a symptom scale. So there's this disconnect between what's sort of an important endpoint. And I think communities of service users have done a lot to reveal that disconnect. So related to this is another example about questioning standard methodologies. So Diana Rose and her team conducted literature around electroconvulsive therapy. So in the past, there'd been other systematic reviews, and they determined that, on average, the benefits outweighed the risk. But when Diana Rose and her team conducted a similar systematic review, but took into account not only quantitative literature, but also qualitative and gray literature, they found other kinds of worries about side effects and risks that just weren't represented in the first body of knowledge, and came to a different conclusion. So this, again, I think, sort of underlines this point about what are the relevant outcome measures, or what are the relevant endpoints, or what's being included in a definition of what's success. And we often see a disconnect between what's happening in conventional research programs and research programs led by service users. So these are assumptions being identified. Another space where we've seen a lot of important work is just the role of pharmaceutical interests. So we've seen lots and lots of people contribute to this particular conversation, but we have seen also service users contributing, those with standpoints. So Sarah Davidow has done a lot of work uncovering the role of conflicts of interest in NAMI, the National Alliance of Mental Illness in the United States. Bhargavi Davar has written about the role of funding in promoting the sort of global mental health research agenda. And lots of other people have written in this space as well. But I think that's an important sort of intersection or value at play that contributes to maybe a stronger objectivity in this space. And finally, this assumption that madness is always pathological. So of course, this is inherent in a lot of research programs in the sciences, but we see a lot of ways in which those with standpoints push against this assumption. So we certainly have more and more discussions about mad pride lately. The notion of dangerous gifts from the Icarus Project can highlight this both sort of negative and positive aspects of being in mental distress here. Neurodiversity, of course, has been, a really important term in the autism community, but also has been taken up largely elsewhere. And also the term crisis as opportunity plays a big role here. Post-traumatic growth is also something that's being spoken about more and more in this literature as well. So these are some of the background assumptions. What are some of the new tools and theories that have been brought to the conversation through those who have attained a standpoint? So novel research programs. I think essentially when you look at the kinds of questions that are being asked, the kinds of questions that are being funded traditionally in the sciences, and then that which is of interest to those who have attained a standpoint, you see big differences in what concerns or interests are. So there's been a big push for research concerning how agency, self-esteem, relationships, trauma impact well-being. So broadening the discussion, not only in terms of hypotheses, but also what kinds of treatments or interventions might be appropriate in this space. We also see more and more interest for explorations of things like coercion, police brutality, involuntary treatment, human rights, dignity. These are not topics that are, consuming a lot of research funding within the sciences, but are really of interest to a lot of people with lived experience. And I think broadly, we can say there's a lot of interest in looking at structural forces as well as individual forces. So there's a lot of push towards shifting research agendas towards these kinds of topics and these kinds of themes. In terms of sort of particular tools, I think it's unsurprising. It makes a lot of sense that a lot of people with lived experience themselves have developed really useful tools within the space. So dialectical behavior therapy, which probably all of you know, is one of sort of the most promising treatments for people with suicidal intent, was developed by Marsha Linehan, who herself had lived experience and a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. We've got Mary Ellen Copeland's Wellness Recovery Action Plans. These are kind of like advanced directives where one can set out a plan for what they'd like to happen if they do end up in crisis or mental distress. MAD Maps look similar to that, are coming from the Icarus Project, the Bapu Trust by Bagari Davar in India, the Harm Reduction Guide for Coming Off Psychiatric Drugs. I think this is kind of a fascinating example right now. This guide came out in 2007, and now here we are in 2021, and now there's a conversation that's growing about tapering, drug withdrawal, starting to have uptake. But this is 14 years ago that there was a clearly recognized need and interest in service user communities, and resources were being developed, largely because there were no mainstream resources and there weren't that many clinicians who were willing to support patients in this kind of project. So I think this really shows, a gap that was being filled outside of the mainstream. So the Hearing Voices Network, probably lots of you have heard about this example. I think it is a familiar one, but it's a useful one in terms of sort of thinking about a new theory that's been put forward and one that is reshaping research paradigms. So the Hearing Voices Network, for those of you who are unfamiliar, is now across the world in hundreds of countries. They act as support groups for those who hear voices and offer a really different kind of model about what it means to hear voices. So they pay a lot of attention to trauma, but they also educate people and support people in trying to develop healthy relationships with the voices that they hear. And we've seen this really interestingly taken up in research programs around auditory hallucinations, where researchers are now interested not only in how do these auditory hallucinations come about and how can we reduce them, but questions of valence of particular hallucinations. So it seems like, what's come out of the Hearing Voices groups and these research programs is a clear consensus that voices can be incredibly distressing and upsetting for some, but in other cases, they're helpful and useful and not problematic. And so the valence of one's voice hearing is really significant. And so research programs are now focusing on how to shift that valence, not only reduce the experience itself. So I think it's a good example of, a theory, a tool sort of being taken up in the mainstream in a useful way. So what do we do with this? So checking the time. So summing up, so on the basis of this, Jordan and I argue that arriving at a standpoint by way of marginalization and critical reflection can indeed lead to an epistemic advantage within the sciences. And involving those who have attained a standpoint in the sciences will contribute to better research by way of these particular epistemic tasks. So identifying problematic assumptions, developing novel tools and theories, and more and stronger objectivity. The third one you've got to sort of take up with the other two. But I think, essentially these three epistemic tasks are clearly, related and tangled with each other. It's kind of hard to pull them apart. And we struggled even organizing the few examples that we had, where to place them in these three tasks. So I just want to talk a little bit about implications and then objections, and then we can open it up to Q&A. So I think the implication, sort of the primary implication, is a rather obvious one. If it is the case that those who have attained a standpoint do have epistemic advantages with regards to the knowledge projects in the sciences, they ought to be included. So the views, skills, expertise of those with standpoints should be incorporated. But I want to spend most of the sort of implications discussion thinking about ways that we shouldn't go about this involvement. And so I think there is a lot of wisdom around this, particularly in the UK, where we have seen a lot of funding related to mental health research require participatory research, or PPI as it's known there, public and patient involvement in some way. And we've seen a lot of really promising versions of that, but we've also seen, I think, a lot of really negative examples of what that involvement can look like. So there's tons and tons of horror stories in the emerging literature there of cases of tokenism. So patients being involved who may not even have the condition of interest within the research study, or patients who are sort of being treated tokenistically. There's a lot of role confusion. So both on the side of researchers and those who are being involved, who just aren't really clear on why they are going about doing this sort of involvement activity or consultation, whatever it looks like. So I think it is really essential to spend time thinking about the reasons behind involvement. So within this paper, we talk a lot about epistemic reasons, what individuals might contribute. I think there's also a lot of ethical reasons, and I've argued elsewhere that we shouldn't forget about those, particularly when trying to structure processes for involvement. But I think getting clear on those, both ethical and epistemic reasons for involving those with lived experience in research projects is really important for getting rid of this role confusion, which is really common, so that people really understand why they're doing this, and therefore understand the way in which they can go about procedurally involving people in a way that's meaningful, that's effective, and that makes sense given their particular research project. Another thing that we hear a lot about is co-optation. So a lot of the movements that have pushed for this involvement come from communities that are outside of the mainstream, outside of our neoliberal institutions that we're a part of, and requiring involvement within these particular academic processes often changes the shape of the message or the goals of those coming from those communities. So we see a lot of worries about, what's getting distilled, what's getting pushed out, and what's being permitted. So we need to make space for not only, involvement in sort of a 1-hour consultation, but real leadership. And I think we see that in the Survivor Research Network in the UK. We do see really good examples of this, but we should be weary of, tokenism, co-optation, essentialism, sort of assuming that there can be complete representation from one individual. If you have one person with a particular diagnosis, they can't necessarily speak for everyone with that diagnosis. And you see lots of that in this space. So I think there's, tons of philosophically rich, but also practically very difficult material going on in this space for those who are interested in this, but a lot of warnings as well. I think another thing we can maybe learn from is this double bind of the professionalized patient. So this is a term I heard a lot when I was living in the UK. this worry that there's particular individuals who are hired over and over again for these involvement projects to consult on projects, but as a result of being involved so often, they're sort of losing touch with the community. They're no longer representative. And so I think that puts these people in a particular kind of bind. So if they are not involved in on the regular, they may be less likely to be informed about particular research methods and able to contribute to projects. But if they are involved too often, they're considered non-representative and therefore aren't included on that basis. So there's sort of this, this way of sort of keeping people down. So they can't both have the expertise with regards to the research methodologies and expertise with regards to lived experience. So I think we should challenge our assumption that one can't have both of those and contribute a lot to a project. So I think as a result, both academic training, research settings will need to be significantly revised. So I think in all sorts of ways, I think, fundamentally, culturally, we have all sorts of assumptions about what knowledge consists of, what knowledge is useful, and what methodologies we ought to use within academia and within the sciences. So we'll need to really rethink some of those to make a shift like this. But I think also just practically, things like, having space and accommodations for wellness, things that we don't often build into our research projects, into our ways of teaching. I do think right now we're having a lot of new discussions about accessibility as a result of the pandemic. So there's a bit of an opening there. But I think there's a lot that needs to shift if these standpoints are going to be taken up. So I'm watching the time. I have 5 objections, but I might just sort of flag them and not answer them, and then you can ask them in the Q&A, so we have lots of time to chat. So, one objection might be, whose values are you sort of designating that one group's values matter more than another's? So that of those who have attained a standpoint in this case. You might ask, is this sort of assuming a kind of essentialism that everyone who is a service user is going to share a particular view? Another objection might be, are these just 2 distinct knowledge projects? So that which is happening in the sciences and the sort of dominant paradigm, and that which is happening outside and being pushed for in this particular paper, are these just 2 different things and they can both exist but don't need to intersect? You might ask, is this relativism? And then 2 of the reviewers who read this paper said, wouldn't it be better if we just take standpoints into account, we just sort of listen to those with lived experience, rather than requiring them to know about research methods, rather than risking the kind of irrationality that might come with their diagnosis. And so I think, this might be something people are thinking. It's certainly something I heard in responses to the paper. So I'll just throw those out there. I'm happy to answer any of them in the Q&A. Thanks, that's it. That's my email too. I can put it in the chat too.
Thank you, Phoebe. Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. So it's now time for the Q&A. So Sarah and I will take questions, but I will ask you to write in the chat, in the public chat, that you have a question, because we cannot see it if you use the raising hand button. And Sarah and I will take the question in order you appear in the chat.
So we're gonna start with Daniel Mattox.
Hi, thank you. That was a great talk. One of the questions I have is sort of about what this looks like across the sciences. So the sort of collective term hides, to a certain degree, the variation between them, right? So it seemed like in your talk, a lot of the focus was on the medical side, like therapy, be it from clinical psychologists or from psychiatrists. But I'm wondering, how exactly does this look in other areas? I'm thinking in particular of community psychology or industrial and organizational psychology, where they're worried about, what psychology can do to inform groups of people or institutions or things like that. How does the the desire to take these sorts of wider epistemic perspectives impact different psychological sciences differently?
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I don't know much about organizational psychology, to be completely honest, but I think maybe sort of the essential thing to do is to return and sort of thinking about a particular project and what kind of involvement ought to take place is to, narrow in on what are the particular justifications for involvement in that particular setting. And so that's something that I'm interested in doing with regards to the sciences, which, as you point out, is still really large. But I think it's important to acknowledge, there's really different justifications at play when you're doing, say, research around hypertension versus research around bipolar disorder. We have radically different histories, problematic histories in research at play in those different contexts, really different relationships of power between those who are clinicians and those who are patients. So I don't know. I mean, I'd almost throw it back to you around something like organizational psychology, but what are the particular dynamics at play there? What's the history? Are people, in that space crying out for a voice, talking about human rights constantly? I think there's so many things in this particular context that are unique and ought to be taken seriously. And then, I think there's also just sort of practical dimensions of, I've heard in response to this, people who do, basic neuroscience be like, what? Like, what? And I think that that's also what I encountered in the UK a lot, was researchers who, yeah, down the line, my research might have implications for people, but it's so far removed at this point. Like, I can't even imagine how to involve, I just don't know what people could contribute. And so I think in those cases, maybe there needs to be involvement is less important. So there's maybe also a sort of dimension of how likely is your work to impact people's lives directly. And the closer you are to that, the more involvement ought to be required. Whereas if you're really far down the line, maybe less. I don't know, but then things like, animal modeling of schizophrenia, which we still do tons of, I feel like there's certainly space for more voices in discussions around that. But I think so there's going to be a bunch of practical considerations and sort of questions about how a particular project might benefit, and then special attention to what kind of justifications, be they ethical, be they epistemic, are at play. That's still kind of a vague answer, but I would challenge you to think about it with regards to organizational psychology or whatever topics you're interested in, and I'd love to read your paper.
We now have a question from Amandine Catala.
Great, thank you so much. First to Sarah and Anne-Marie, I guess, for organizing this. This is really great. And to Phoebe, of course, for your really great talk. Thank you so much. So my question had to do with something that you mentioned towards the end of your talk about transforming academic research and I assume also professional settings. And I guess my concern is, so I'm all for it, obviously. In fact, the question is, how can we make it the case that this isn't just left at the discretion of whoever is in charge in these various sorts of settings and organizations? I'm worried a lot that a lot of the time this is, like I said, left at people's discretion, sort of their goodwill. It's often seen also, I don't know if that's what you were referring to, but you were saying some people are implementing this and they're not really sure what they're after in doing this. And so it's like there's a lot of confusion, and sometimes it's misperceived as some sort of like charity, like, or some sort of, I don't know. So I was wondering if you had any insights into or thoughts about how we might secure sort of a more, sort of better ensure basically that these transformations can take place without relying on people's goodwill or discretion. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a huge, important question. So I'll try and give like a bit of an answer, but I'll also say, Nev Jones has written a lot of really important work on, barriers to involvement of people with lived experience in the sciences in particular. And so particularly with Robin Brown. She's got a few papers I just think are really insightful about how particularly we might transform processes. But I think you're right, like there is currently, it's mostly who wants to do it and what changes can they make sort of on a small scale with the projects that they're doing. And that isn't sufficient. I'm reading Nora Loretto's book right now. I don't know if any of you know her. Anyway, she's talking about this historical fight for maternity leave in Canada and just how much work went into that. And I think, we need a similar kind of battle here, and we need structural changes that make space, and probably across all sorts of dimensions. So I think about things like admissions processes, which are exclusionary in all sorts of ways. So in one paper of Nev Jones and Robin Brown, they talk about how any disclosure of a mental health diagnosis was referred to as the kiss of death. Like it's just, exclusion immediately. And I've certainly heard conversations in committee meetings that I've been in of like, oh, that student, or, oh, we don't want one of those. It's certainly at play. So just from the very beginning of like entering the academy, if someone wants to go that conventional route, and then, all sorts of barriers and people being booted out if they have a crisis, there's just so many things that take place that, I've watched so many friends, collaborators, people I care about, make the steps towards entering this space and wanting to contribute and having a voice in it. And then just realize, like, after a few years, this is not a place for me. It's too much fight. It's not welcoming. I don't know if my work will be meaningful. So I think there's a million things at play. And I worry, I think we need like sort of specific procedural changes. But I also worry about the sort of institutionalization, like what I saw in the UK, and maybe there's people here who can speak to that, was these requirements being built in, but this cultural shift hadn't taken place. And so you were lacking the goodwill, but you had the structure. And in other cases, like maybe more common here, you have goodwill, but no structure. And both of those, I think, are a failure. So it's like we need this big conversation and shift, and we need these sort of structural changes. Yeah.
That's great, thank you.
Uphill.
We now have a question from Richard Saville Smith.
Hi. I'm just before I ask my question, just say that I live in the UK and on the Isle of Skye. And just to say that the key point about the inclusion of diverse people within research is that if you actually try and become a PI, you're stuffed. That's my experience, is that it's too long a story, so we don't need to go there. My question is, you talk about standpoint theory. I could have substituted standpoint theory for MAD studies all the way along. So why do you choose standpoint theory rather than MAD studies? And before I let you answer, I'd just say that I'd advocate for MAD studies, because what MAD studies does is it gives you a little bit more definition about your standpoint.
Great, thank you so much. And I'm jealous that you're on the Isle of Skye. Yeah, so first off, the PI issue, I completely agree. And, I probably should have said in response to Em and Dean's question, just thinking about issues with regards to inclusion with research ethics boards or committees or IRBs, whatever you call them, there can be so many bureaucratic hurdles just with regards to getting somebody on a project able to see the data that's being considered. Like a PI position is pretty much impossible if you don't have an institutional affiliation and you don't have an income through that and somewhere to put your butt, there's just the bureaucracy behind it is a huge barrier. So yeah, I couldn't agree more. With your question about MAD studies, I mean, I agree. I think that's another avenue you could make the same argument, and maybe better, as you point out. I think so, to be honest, it's sort of accidental, feminist standpoint theory. I came up in philosophy, that's my background. And I just have always loved feminist philosophy of science and feminist epistemology. And so that's just something that I was exposed to, and given my also involvement in this world, to me, they really spoke to each other, and I hadn't seen much work that brought the two together. So in one way, I just hope to bridge discussions amongst philosophers who I think are really interested in questions about involvement, inclusion, epistemology, all this stuff. But I haven't connected that much with some of the amazing work in MAD studies, in survivor research that is going on. So, in one sense, it's sort of like I hope to, push those groups towards each other. But that's not really like a answer of why it's better. I think it's sort of accidental. To me, I think it does some of the work I want it to do, answers some of the questions, like helps me explore a territory I'm interested in. But yeah, I wouldn't disagree that you could do the same thing with MAD studies. I think you're right.
The next question is from Christian Pering.
Hi, how you doing, Phoebe? Good to see you. Thanks for the talk. I guess I have a couple of very closely related questions. I guess I'm wondering, I guess the question is partly about relativism and whether you are being relativist or not. So to put it kind of more, to give you some practical examples, I'm thinking like, well, how do you know which groups or which standpoints count as being marginalized? So I was thinking, like, what about if you have like a men's rights group who are complaining that men's rights have been marginalized? Would there be some way of assessing whether that's a marginalized viewpoint or not? And I was also thinking about, are some standpoints more valuable than others? I mean, or is it possible that some standpoints are justly marginalized? Like, so I was thinking about Christian scientists. Like, I think you could probably say, the viewpoint of Christian scientists has been marginalized within psychiatry. So would you want to include a Christian scientist standpoint in the studies?
Good. Okay, those are great questions. And I'm glad you asked this. So this, I think, is one of the sort of key objections. And we see in feminist philosophy of science, feminist epistemology, the sort of split that occurred between those who favored standpoint theory and those who favored feminist empiricism. And the heart of the split is very much how you answer this question of, who ought we bring to the table? And so critiques of standpoint theory say, this seems to be favoring a particular kind of partiality when we have a lot of partialities out there. We all recognize there's values, viewpoints, we all have our socially situated, knowledge is socially situated. But the standpoint theory says, no, we want to favor those who are marginalized, those who are oppressed, who have experienced oppression because they have this unique insight. And the empiricists say, it's not really fair to choose that one view. We've got to allow everyone to come to the table, men's rights, Christian scientists, feminists, whoever, they all get to come to the table and then battle it out in the scientific, pursuit. So I think the typical standpoint response to that, and the one that I'll take, is that there isn't really a view being favored here, or even a sort of certain kind of partiality. There's certainly a marginalization as a component of what makes up a standpoint theory, but there isn't a singular view. So people, even who are marginalized in the sciences, are going to come to radically different conclusions about what research ought to be done, what research priorities, methods, et cetera, as we see. Like, there's huge diversity across these communities and very different approaches. It's really just a point about epistemic potential that's being made. So it isn't that one view is better than the other view. And with standpoint theory, you really can't say anything about it in advance about where you're going to end up and what's the better starting point. It's really just saying, look, if this group of people who has the power with regards to knowledge creation has been making the knowledge for a really long time, they're probably just going to be less able to see some of the problematic stuff that underlies that body of knowledge. But if you're over here and you aren't invested in it, and you've possibly been harmed by it, you're just going to be more attuned to that sort of faulty foundation or the bits of it that are faulty. And you should come on over and point out those problems. So it's not, choosing a favorite view or even saying, one view is better than another. It's really just a point about epistemic potential. Does that answer?
Yeah, I mean, I see where you're going, I guess. Yeah, I mean, there's more discussion to be had, but that sounds like a good answer. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
We have now Daniel Mosley.
Yeah, thank you to the organizers, and thank you, Phoebe, for the presentation. I really enjoyed it quite a bit, and I hope I can make it through my question without my dog barking. So apologies in advance if she chimes in. So my question is, there's a lot of buzz now in psychiatry about the use of classical psychedelics for the purposes of therapy. And I was just sort of wondering, I just want to pose this as something to explore a bit. In some of the research that's been done by, say, Matt Johnson at Johns Hopkins on this, people who have taken some of the classical psychedelics like psilocybin report having experiences of openness to the world that they had not experienced prior to trying out the psychedelics. And so I was wondering, if this in a way might pose a kind of challenge to standpoint theory, if we could get expanded epistemic agency in these ways that don't involve social marginalization and these sort of social systemic factors. And it's in fact a psychopharmaceutical that's creating these expanded senses of epistemic agency, if that's a problem or if maybe that's something that could be incorporated within standpoint theory.
Thanks. I mean, that's really interesting. I'm glad you asked about psychedelics. I've been thinking about them a lot lately. I'm working on a project around thinking about the intersection of madness and psychedelics. But you went a different direction than I expected you to, which is your question about whether we might attain standpoints through psychedelics as opposed to, through these experiences of marginalization. And I think, that may well be the case. I think it's, clear that psychedelics let you think in another kind of way, and there might be potential in those ways of thinking. I wouldn't go as far as to say we could replace these particular standpoints that I'm interested in with the standpoints that might be created through psychedelic use, because I think, they're just really different starting points, and there might be pieces that you have in your potential through your marginalization that you just wouldn't be exposed to through psychedelic use. So, even just think about the discussion we're currently having around defunding the police. Like, this discussion has been going on for a very long time in marginalized communities who are absolutely aware of, being a person of color, having a, mental distress experience and having the cops called, and how those can combine to create a horrible experience that is, can be much more harmful than beneficial. And that kind of marginalization, that kind of awareness comes very much from lived experience directly. But a lot of those who are in power and shaping knowledge around how we respond to people in crisis, how we make decisions around funding police, just aren't aware, and only recently are becoming aware. So I think, if you think about something like that, just being a part of a community, living in a certain place, being aware of certain kinds of risks, is what gives you that standpoint at the end of the day. I don't know, are you going to get that through psychedelic use? Like, you might get more openness, and you might, later expose yourself to more. But I think some of those sort of essential lived experience pieces of being there, living something, and, having insight as a result of that, you might not get that on your trip. I don't know. but it's a great question.
A question now from Patty Sanchez Garcia.
Okay, thanks. I will use a translator because my English is very poor and I use just to put down, okay? Wait. I'm here.
First of all, sorry for my poor English. I am Mexican and will use a translator to make sure I am not wrong. I will speak from my experience as a person diagnosed with borderline. Graduate in philosophy and master's degree in philosophy of science and psychoanalysis. This point of view I like, but it will not be a new way of systematizing, pointing out on people diagnosed, even victimized. While it is a position of the dignified and the scholars, I think that the way to eradicate a methodological bias also has to do with the way it is diagnosed. That is to say, question more the consequences of the diagnosis and less the one diagnosed.
Sorry, and thanks.
Great, thank you. So I hope that I got the sort of thrust of your question that, this project is, drawing attention to those who've received a diagnosis, but we should actually be questioning the project of diagnosis of those giving the diagnoses. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so I wouldn't say those projects are mutually exclusive. And so I think it actually might be the case that your suggestion is sort of a necessary or inevitable result of the suggestion of this project, that if you expand the body of stakeholders or experts or who gets to contribute to knowledge in the sciences, one of the sort of essential knowledge products is the diagnostic criteria that we use. And I think there has been some really interesting work thinking about this in philosophy of psychiatry, is like who ought to be contributing to the diagnostic criteria. Like right now we know pharmaceutical industry funding plays a huge role in shaping the DSM. And so we might want to shift who contributes. And as a result, we might end up with a really different kind of diagnostic system, and maybe also different processes for diagnosis or what that kind of engagement looks like. So I like your suggestion. I think it could be closely related. I don't see this as at odds with that. Okay. I think they're compatible, but yeah, I appreciate the question.
Thanks.
Now a question from Keyao Young.
1 second. Yes, thank you very much for your talk. So here is my question. So what you talk about remind me of like the type of people who are marginalized and who have like traumatic experiences. So one thing I can think of about these people is when they give their testimony about their experiences and about explaining, interpreting what they feel, one way to understand what they say is that they are contributing a new insight into the discussion. But another way that I can imagine many people tend to see this is like, if you look at theories in clinical psychology and psychiatry, there are readily available theories that explain these people's testimony into something like biases, right? So for some people who have like certain personality disorder diagnosis, if you look at their testimony from the perspective of like a clinical psychology theory, what you see might not be insight, but instead an interpretation such as, oh, they're being distrustful or they're being manipulated. Like the so-called insight from some other people's perspective are exactly the expression of their sickness. So I think there is a special difficulty in acknowledging the epistemic, you call it advantage or value of people who have a psychiatric diagnosis, in particular certain type of psychiatric diagnosis. So I guess I have two questions, but actually like just on the same issue, but from two different directions. So the first question would be, so for those people who are marginalized and have traumatic experience in the past, how can they be justified? How can their testimony be justified? For that question, I thought what you mentioned about critical reflection might be kind of an answer to that, but I also want to hear more from you about what you think. And another direction to ask this is, well, so much being said, when we look at theories in clinical psychology, since they are like classic theories, of course, there got to be a fair amount of truth in there. Otherwise, it would be crazy that so many people in decades have relied on them so much. So how can we just like still appreciate the amount of truth in those classic theories, but in the meantime also kind of appreciate the insight of people with like different marginalized and traumatic experiences, and kind of appreciate both of them at the same time? Thank you.
Great, thank you. I mean, I think you put that really well, in that, you know, one individual's insight might be perceived as a bias or, you know, a symptom by someone else. And I think that is, you know, this sort of extra hurdle that I mentioned when trying to think about there being an epistemic advantage in this space. There is already an assumption of a lack of reason or irrationality, or, you know, an inability to be an epistemic agent that goes along with a diagnosis of a mental disorder. And I think that hurdle applies both to those involved in research programs who, you know, might need to open up to the idea that there could be insight in this other way, not insight in the sort of like you acknowledge you're ill way, but insight into, you know, one's experience and research in this way. But that also often applies to individuals themselves. So what you see in this space is a lot of people talking about how, you know, they received a diagnosis, they learned what goes along with that, which means, you know, they ought not to trust themselves. Other people will trust them less. You know, they take on that sort of irrationality or other characteristics. And so that, I think you're right, that it's this period of critical reflection that is essential, but that might involve sort of unlearning stories about yourself that you've been told, and, you know, going beyond that to say, not only am I epistemically faulty and unable to contribute, which is what you might have been told, but actually I might have a unique perspective, an advantage here with something to share. And I think that is unique to this sort of mental health space, where really with your diagnosis comes this denial of rationality, but we don't see that in other spaces of medicine so often, certainly in some areas, you know, chronic pain, and there's definitely worrisome parallels. But so I think it would be in that process of critical reflection where that sort of learning to justify and appreciate one's epistemic advantage would take place. I don't know, does that answer the first question? Yeah. And then the second one, oh yeah, so the second one's about, you know, we've got all these classic theories that have been built up and, you know, defended over tons of times. So how can we appreciate both? And I think, you know, I don't see that as a big worry. I definitely don't think recognizing standpoint, involving people with standpoint means that the entire, you know, sciences bases will crumble. Like, I think there's lots we'll hold on to. There's lots worth holding on to. But it just makes it all the more likely that those places where there is a really shaky foundation, or there might be some sort of bias or problematic foundation to a particular piece of knowledge or area of knowledge, those are just more likely to be identified. And so I don't think it's a threat to all that we know. And I think there's lots that can still be held onto and celebrated.
Thank you. Next question is from Onur Kanpolat. Sorry, I'm misspelling the name probably.
No, it's totally okay. So thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting to me. But my question is about the epistemic advantage that you were implying by the standpoint theory, and I guess I basically try to understand what we try to understand by that standpoint theory is that if we lack a necessary knowledge concerning social illustrated knowledge, we would not be fully able to understand the circumstances we are trying to understand. Or is it just try to say that it would be better if we have that standpoint theory and social illustrated knowledge? Because once we say that it would not be possible for us to fully understand the circumstances that we are trying to understand, then it would have certain implications concerning the ways that we understand the phenomena. And I don't know, like, so basically I just want to try to understand what you really imply by the theory.
Yeah, great. I mean, that's the great question. I'm glad you asked that. So what I mean is sort of the weaker thesis, in that it's really just by having the lived experience, or, you know, particularly by achieving the lived experience or the social location, gives one the potential, the epistemic potential to achieve a standpoint. But, you know, what you're going to do with that standpoint, pursuing this particular knowledge project or coming up with this hypothesis, is not essentially attached to that lived experience or social location. So it's not the case that other people without that experience can come up with the same hypothesis. It's absolutely not that. So you can come up with these ideas from a lot of different directions. It's really just a bit of a boost in saying, you know, you're just a little bit more likely, coming from that experience of marginalization, to be able to identify what's going on. There's just, if you are in sort of the ruling class, you're less likely to see what you're sitting on might not be that sturdy. You're also, you know, invested in maintaining it because it suits you, it works for you. So it's really, you know, there's no essential knowledge attached to any social location. I think that is really important. And even, you know, people with the same diagnosis or who grew up in the same kind of community are going to have really different knowledge, different approaches. And I think that's consistent. Thanks.
Okay, next question would be Catherine Stinson.
Thanks, Phoebe. That was really fascinating. And for me, it was doubly so because the other area that I work in is ethics of artificial intelligence, and everything you were saying has parallels there, and the same kinds of conversations are going on about who should be involved in research. And so there's a question in that context that I've been puzzling over, and I was wondering whether maybe you have some insight into it from this context. And that question is, how do we pick out who the marginalized people are, and whether there are objective ways of doing that? And part of that is sort of in response to the whose values question and the kind of challenges that Kristen Paring was bringing up. Should men's rights groups, or should cognitive diversity be considered just as valuable as other kinds of diversity? So are there answers to that are sort of more specific than just it's the oppressed people? And, you know, how do we know who the oppressed people are?
Yeah, this is such a good question, Catherine. And yeah, I feel like I kind of half answered Christian. I feel bad. He did have that part too, which I didn't really go into detail. But I think, you know, this is such an important question. And, you know, I've been following these discussions sort of from much more of an arm's length in the sort of AI participatory research space too. And I think it's way harder there because, like, the public is literally everyone on the globe. Like, it's just so much more enormous. And I think it's way harder. Like in Montreal, we have all these sort of participatory AI ethics events and things going on. And like, I went to some of them and it's just like a few grad students in computer science. It's really not representative. It's just whoever kind of comes along. And I think part of it is there's this role confusion, this lack of consideration about who ought to be involved. So I think my response is thinking about, so I think one maybe good model we can use to think about it is like, who is most likely to be disproportionately harmed by the policies, the knowledge, that comes out of these. So I know in biobanking discussions, they've done a lot of work to do like deliberative democratic events, participatory kind of stuff around shaping biobanking policies, because you have a similar, need for public consent, but you don't really know who to ask. And you can't ask everyone every time you use a sample in a biobank. It's just not possible. So what they do in those cases is they often disproportionately represent in the sort of public engagement events people that are most likely to be the most harmed or to have the most particular kind of objection. So in British Columbia, in the event they did around biobanking there, they overrepresented Indigenous people, people with rare diseases, people with cancers that were going to be subject to research there. So I don't know who that looks like exactly with AI in general, but you can imagine like AI applications with regards to policing certain kinds of populations might be most likely to be disproportionately harmed. And then similar with AI applications in health, like is it for a particular condition? Like, so there might be some groups or communities that pop up that you might want to represent more than others. I think really it has to be done sort of on a project by project basis. It's really hard. I have very little faith in like the 1 million ethics guidelines for AI we've seen appear in the last 20 years. And I think it would be the same for something like the sciences. Like it needs to be more specific than that. So I guess marginalization, similar to standpoints, ought to be thought about in relation to the knowledge project or the discipline. So one's particular kind of marginalization is going to give one potential for an advantage with regards to some knowledge projects, but not all. And similarly, one's knowledge project might benefit more from involving those with some kinds of standpoints, but not others. Does that, I mean, it's maybe not a full answer. It's a tough question.
Okay, we might have time for one last question. So I was after that, I don't know if I say it right.
Okay. Hi, Phoebe.
Hey.
Great lecture. I really enjoyed it. So first, I want to say sort of like, I want to acknowledge the value of standpoint epistemology. And I think it's wonderful, and I think psychiatry and sciences in particular are in desperate need for inclusion of more standpoints. But it's sort of like it occurs to me that each standpoint comes with sort of like certain advantages, but then there are also certain unique disadvantages. So it's possible that there are certain standpoints that are marginalized. And so because of, and by virtue of that marginalization, they might have access to certain sort of like forms of knowledge that other standpoints might not have. But they might also be susceptible to certain forms of biases that other standpoints might not have. And I'm wondering sort of like, to what extent has this been addressed in the literature, this idea that by introducing more standpoints, we're not just sort of like, adding more sort of like, epistemic advantage, but also potentially more sources of biases and more sources of error. And a sort of extreme example, I think with my mind would be sort of like the area of vaccinations, where you sort of like have a very flourishing anti-vaccine movement. And sort of like, so that's like one standpoint that is sort of like susceptible to a sort of like a wide range of sort of like distortions that the scientific community sort of like, might be wary of. Sort of like, so how to address that situation? And a related sort of like question is that when we are including and sort of like, taking into account these additional standpoints, is there also an expectation that we are adjusting our standards of scientific rigor? So for example, you mentioned the Rose et al. Study regarding the ECT. It just so happens that a few months ago, I was reviewing a manuscript that was sort of like ECT related. And I sort of I pointed out to the author that that you had not included the sort of the study by Rose et al. And the author said that they didn't feel that it was methodologically rigorous enough to be included in their particular review. And so that does pose a challenge, if we are including additional standpoints, is there also an expectation that we would adjust what we would consider to be standards of rigor in a particular scientific domain?
Great. Okay, those are both really good questions. So the first one about, I think you're absolutely right. If you're adding new people with different social locations, different standpoints, they might have epistemic advantages, but might have their own biases too. I think, I wouldn't be too worried, given that these fields are still widely dominated by other kinds of people without those social locations. And so if we think of these communities as sort of offering correctives to each other, and that's largely, a big part of what those with standpoints are contributing is a kind of corrective ability to identify biases, assumptions that might be at play. It seems like we're certainly going to have enough people who are coming from another position to identify the biases that might be brought by those with standpoints. So hopefully they won't sort of win out at the end of the day. It's just the good ideas that they'll bring and their ability to critique things that weren't previously critiqued that'll be present. I think sort of the anti-vaccine case, I'd have to think about it more. I mean, I don't know if that's a great parallel in terms of marginalization. I mean, so I really like Maya Goldenberg's work on this issue, which tries to sort of reframe the discussion as not, this is reason over here in vaccine development, and this is unreason in the anti-vax movement, but really there is a huge issue of mistrust in medicine that's feeding these worries about vaccine hesitancy. And so I think in that sense, there is a kind of marginalization, but it's not clear to me that it's marginalization specifically from vaccine development or vaccine research. I think it's more broadly experiences with clinicians. So a lot of people within those communities have had a lot of negative experiences within healthcare, have not found explanations or empathy or warmth or understanding, and have found many of those things in communities that are also vaccine hesitant. So to me, it's not clear that the source of marginalization is sort of appropriate, or I don't know if the sort of inclusion in vaccine development projects is the right solution. I mean, maybe it is, because it might build more trust in a sense, which could be useful. But it feels like less of a match, the sort of vaccine development, vaccine hesitance communities as compared to the sciences and those who have attained a standpoint with lived experience in mental health, like that. This example feels more connected to me, but I would maybe want to think about it more. So that's kind of a partial answer. Your second question about, losing rigor. I mean, it seems entirely possible that some of our methodological standards might change, and that seems okay to me. Rigor is certainly like an epistemic quality that we hold up. It's a positive one. I wouldn't want to lose it, especially if it's benefiting us. But it seems certainly possible. So like the Diana Rose example, I don't know enough about it, whether to say, but certainly, including gray literature in a systematic review is not conventional. And I can see a lot of people saying like, absolutely not, like that is not following the typical protocol and therefore is not rigorous. I don't know if I would use the word rigor there. I would say that's not conventional, but it doesn't seem obvious to me that excluding the gray literature is the right way to go. So I think you know, it's certainly possible that rigor could be lost. I think it's likely that methodological choices will change, or a lot of discussions about methodology will arise. But I don't know, with that particular example, I don't know, I'd need to hear more to be convinced that, you know, rigor is being lost in that particular case. You know, I certainly think including gray literature is an excellent way to expand, you know, who's involved in the conversation, and, you know, often a really important thing to do, so that we're not just hearing the same voices over and over again. Yeah.
All right, so I think we will have to stop here. So this is the end of this second session of the Philosophy of Psychiatry webinar. So for those of you who enjoyed this event, we have another one in 2 weeks. So we are happy to have Rachel Cooper from Lancaster University. We'll give a talk entitled "The Concept of Mental Disorder Revisited, Robustly Value-Laden Despite Conceptual Change." So as always, you can register on our website. You can also follow our Facebook page for more information. And finally, I would like to thank our speaker, Phoebe Friesen, for this exciting talk. It was very interesting, very rich. And also thank you to all of you for being here. It's a great pleasure to see how many people are enthusiastic about this webinar. So thank you very much. And we look forward to seeing you all in 2 weeks. So bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.